The first speaker is one of our own staff members who's working on the MFA program at the moment with us, which is Dr. Alyssa Grossman. And Alyssa is going to talk about her sort of research work, which deals with the nature of ethnography, memory, and the museum. So let's do it.
In this talk, I'm just going to outline a project that I'm actually currently developing. I'm in the process of applying for funding, getting organized, planning this out. And it's still in its kind of early stages, so I'm still forming ideas about how exactly I'm going to approach it, what specific directions it might take, so just take it as a work in progress. I'm currently working as a research associate here at Valand, but I just recently finished my work as a postdoc with the University of Gothenburg's Critical Heritage Initiative. So I'm a social and visual anthropologist, so I'm used to speaking more to people in my own field, so I'd be curious to see what kind of different kinds of responses I get from this group. My research recently has been looking at memory practices, and mainly memory connected to objects, sites, discourses, and landscapes in everyday life, but in the context of post-communist Romania, which is where my fieldwork has been. And my methods have tended to involve experimental practices, including filmmaking, but also other kind of sensorial methodologies. And my work also involves, over the years, it's involved a series of collaborations with a visual artist. Her name is Selena Kimball. She lives in New York, and she's based at Parsons School of Design. And over, I'd say, the past decade and a half, we've worked on films together, texts, installations, and exhibitions, kind of creating our own dialogues between her field of visual art and my field of anthropology, which have, over the years, have kind of taken their own forms and shapes. So the project that I'm going to speak about today is one that I've been working on with Selena to develop. We've called Cross-Cutting Collections, Reassembling the Ethnographic Museum. And we've been looking at specifically how archival collections at an ethnographic museum could be retrieved and engaged with in order to invite alternative interpretations of its holdings. So we're asking questions like, how might certain creative or artistic practices convey new narratives about these anthropological collections, but then at the same time without avoiding or denying the difficult colonial histories that are associated with these collections. What new approaches could we use together not as a sort of artist coming in from the outside, but as a kind of cooperative effort between an anthropologist and an artist to contest the accepted taxonomies and challenge the implicit power relations embedded in these kinds of institutions. And ethnographic museums have long been critiqued for perpetuating racist descriptions of the so-called ethnographic other, reinforcing cultural hierarchies through practices of collection, classification, and display. And as I'm sure that we'll talk about today in all the presentations, there are many different forms of response to these established institutional practices of representation. So my current project is actually in affiliation with the Museum of World Culture here in Gothenburg. And I'll explain it, but first I want to go back in history a bit and return to the legacy of the surrealists and their particular intersections with the discipline of anthropology. And then I'll also talk a little bit about the anthropological concept of bricolage, just to address some of the ideas behind the project that I'm developing now. So as you all probably know, there's a well-known history of artists borrowing ethnographic methods, specifically ethnographic methods from anthropology. But then there's a whole history behind this that I think tends to be overlooked, at least in my field of anthropology. And this is the fact that the surrealists had actually a really interesting relationship with anthropology. And maybe, I don't know if artists are taught about this today, but it's something that in my field in social anthropology doesn't really get discussed anymore. So you had artists such as Carl Einstein, Michel Léry, André Scheffner, Paul Rivet, Marcel Griot, particularly those that were based in France during the 1920s and 30s. Were involved to various degrees in anthropological ideas and practice. So, for example, Griot led the Dakar-Djibouti expedition in 1931 to Senegal and Eritrea, and he was I don't know how he defined himself, but he was definitely an artist, a surrealist, but then he worked on these kind of anthropological projects. And he used explicitly anti-colonialist approaches to studying the rituals, dance, music, and material culture of the local inhabitants. And another example is the surrealist journal Minotaur, which was used as a catalog to the opening exhibition of collected artifacts at the Musée de l'Homme in Paris. But many other surrealists who weren't explicitly working as anthropologists also tended to, it was part of their methodology to address scientific discourses and assumptions in their art, precisely for the sake of questioning these discourses and challenging them. So, for example, many surrealist exhibitions of the time adhered to the kind of conventions of ethnographic display, but at the same time they broke with certain norms that were expected to be followed in these contexts. So they explicitly used these tactics for undermining and exposing existing codes of representation. Their displays also tended to combine so-called tribal art with surrealist and found objects in order to, again, to parody and condemn colonialist anthropological practices of commodification and exoticization. Then you have the surrealist journal Document, founded by Bataille in 1929, who was kind of a dissident surrealist at the time, which brought together discussions in art, ethnography, archaeology, photography, and popular culture, and again, adopting and critiquing scientific rhetoric and ethnographic rhetoric. So through questioning conventional categorizations of material culture, through these various techniques that they use of assemblage, fragmentation, recomposition, this journal itself became a kind of playful museum that served as an avenue of cultural criticism at the time. And the surrealists' aims were primarily political, and this is something that's often forgotten about when they're talked about today. It being a political movement first and an artistic movement kind of second to that. So in Breton's first Surrealist Manifesto in 1924, he wrote that their goal was to, quote, to liberate humanity from the ideological shackles that enforce the contradiction between dream and waking life. So they were influenced by Marxist politics, Freudian psychoanalysis, German and occult philosophy, and this whole appeal to the dreams, the irrational, unconscious life. They wanted the sort of fundamental drive underneath that was to undermine things like positivism, to emancipate the imagination, and look towards, I quote again, solutions to the gravest problems of human existence. So keep that in mind. So over the decades, the group diverged and split into many ideological and aesthetic factions, but it's, for me, I'm trying to bring up the importance of these early dialogues between the surrealists and anthropology. This is a picture of Ray de Lucia installing a model in one of the dioramas at the American Museum of Natural History. So the surrealists wanted to get people to question how material culture can be categorized and interpreted, and then remind us that even though an image may resemble something, it doesn't automatically mean that the image itself refers to a real object or concrete reality. So they played with the conventions of indexicality and documentation in order to reinforce this notion that reality is never given, it's always made. And they knew that the best way, the most effective way to get people to understand this idea was paradoxically through the use of realism on the level of a signifier. So by adhering to these documentary and realist techniques of representation, in order to first inspire belief in these images, and then subverting what's ordinarily done with these images, they wanted to jar viewers into a more kind of powerful awareness of the complexities of claims to things like representational truth. So I don't know, this might be really obvious to people in the artistic fields, but among my anthropological colleagues, these particular ties and questions between anthropology and surrealism are not actually very well known. It was in the late 80s and 90s, cultural anthropology did look towards surrealism, particularly because they were trying to discuss these issues of cultural representation that were at that time really highly charged. And James Clifford is one of the most prominent anthropologists who delved into the connection between these realms, notably in his book, The Predicament of Culture, where he writes a whole chapter on ethnographic surrealism, is what he calls it. So he calls attention to these connections between surrealism and anthropology's shared concerns with things like self-reflexivity, an attention towards the fragment, and a broad critique of hierarchies of value. But since these debates over 30 years ago, social scientists have not devoted a lot of attention to these intersections between these fields of surrealism and anthropology. So that's kind of giving a bit of a background. So the project that I'm going to speak about now returns to these legacies in certain ways, both in theory and in practice. And I think they're still really relevant to the contemporary work that bridges anthropological and artistic research. And I think there's a lot that could be learned from looking to these experiments in the past that have really kind of been neglected for a while. So I'll talk a little bit about these concepts of bricolage I mentioned before, assemblage, and the notion of curator. Curator, according to Hamilton and Scottness, is an experimental curatorial practice that creatively re-engages with colonial histories to re-envision how these histories relate to the contemporary globalized world. So using expanded technologies of labeling, photographing, inscribing, and conjoining of disparate items, a curative approach reappropriates and reconfigures archival collections in the present. So it acknowledges the discursive power and authority that accompany both museological and fine arts practices of organizing and preserving accumulations of artifacts, while seeking to unsettle their ontological and epistemological meanings. So it underlines the significance of objects, not just through their cultural history, so seeing the object as a kind of information, but also through the object's material, sensory, and corporeal properties. This ties in to assemblage theory, which is also an emergent museological discourse that I would say integrates perspectives from art and anthropology. It's a perspective of museum systems that treats all things in storage as diasporic, composed of material and discursive elements, unable to be reductively categorized as social or even human, which then points to the pluralized relationships and agencies in museum collections. So looking at museum assemblages as relational entities that produce new configurations of power and space through processes of mutation and fragmentation, the agency of an assemblage can be relocated, so not just found in individual acts and things, but in distributions across various collectives. So my project that I'll talk about, I'll get to eventually, involves turning to assemblage and bricolage as means of subverting and questioning the institutionally represented material object. Bricolage is also a term that involves putting disparate images, objects, or text together in new ways, but involves a level of what the anthropologist Levi-Strauss called mythical thought. And again, I'm going back to kind of classic, Levi-Strauss is a classic anthropologist proposing ideas of structuralism that he's not really brought into contemporary anthropological discourses. So I'm trying to go back, to return to certain things and bring them together in new ways. Okay, so to give you a little bit of an idea of what this project is actually going to involve. We're going to be hopefully working at the Museum of World Culture here in Gothenburg and looking at and going into their archives. And I'll just give you a kind of overview of what our plan is. I will sort of start doing extensive research in the archives of the museum. Look through their collections, but also through their archive texts and documents related to the objects that they have. And also, just as a kind of background, the Museum of World Culture is now going through a huge kind of reorganization process where they're starting to develop a new set of permanent collections. So they're actually going back into their collections and revisiting them and figuring out what they're going to use in sort of new presentations. So there's a little bit of sort of transition and upheaval going on there now anyway. So we'll kind of try and enter into this context. And the idea is that I will select a number of artifacts and send to Selena, my collaborator, an image of each artifact that I choose. So this is not from the Museum of World Culture, this is from a different ethnographic museum. But it's just, we did a sort of pilot study of this project last year. So this is just to give you an idea of what this work might look like. So this is an example of an object, typical ethnographic museum object and presentation. And then the accompanying explanatory text. So as you can see, this object is labeled as a robe. The text says it's from the northern plains of the USA or Canada. It's made in the first half of the 19th century. It gives you this kind of information about it. The text also tells you it's made out of bison hide, glass beads, porcupine quills, and paint. And then the object description, which I don't know if you can see, I'll read you a few sentences. Decorated by various means, such bison robes were worn instead of jackets in the large parts of Central North America. Men could illustrate their victorious war deeds on these robes, although relatively few examples have been preserved. The painting shows the protagonists in several fighting scenes with representatives of different tribes, la la la. So a typically dry museum catalog entry giving you these facts, these dates, descriptive information about the piece. So we'll take, after I send an original image like this to Selena, she will focus on the image, she'll take it and cut it up and collage it into a new two-dimensional image of a new object, so a new museum object that they could have in their collection. And then I will cut up the text and make a collage out of the text to make a new text that refers back to Selena's new object. So this is in the pilot study that we did. This is her new object, only made out of the original material that we have found in the archives. So I relabeled it. It's not a robe anymore. It's called the hero, which a word that also comes from the original text. And then my description, well, I don't know if you could call it a description of the object, but the text that is associated with the object. It says the worn victorious object, and these are all words that came from the original description. It left an impression. First a temporal study, part painting, not information. A distinguished audience attended the production, while men in white clothing acquired their weapons, tracing through glass the seam of events. A life portrayed, too few deeds recognized. The exact value of such institutionalized objects cannot be shown. So, by using only the images and sentences from the primary archival sources to create our new objects and descriptions, I argue that we somehow are engaging in bricolage, becoming bricoleurs, experimenting with form, using a self-contained body of content. And as Levi-Strauss wrote, he was really the first person to sort of theorize bricolage in an anthropological context. The bricolaur's universe of instruments is closed, and the rules of his game are always to make do with whatever is at hand. And actually, while he was writing about this, it was also a theme that the surrealists were discussing and doing. So the bricolaur assembles existing odds and ends, leftover things from individuals and society, and for Levi-Strauss, bricolage is actually a form of mythical thought, he calls it, relevant to anthropology, as it involves processes of ordering and making sense of the universe, using underlying structures of classification. This ties back to his theories of structuralism. And he argues that both art and science have a demand for organization, and we need to recognize and validate taxonomies that are based along aesthetic lines, not just so-called scientific ones. So this is just another one of our pilot studies. Each new and visual and textual collage that we make consists only of elements found in the original material. So we're not adding any new words or images. Everything comes directly from the original sources. This is another example of an Eskimo mask made of wood from Alaska. It says it's purchased by the museum from a German trading firm. And the original description says, the wood carver of the mask mastered his art by creating a human face with conspicuously slanted features. The round left eye is open, the right slot-shaped one is tightly closed, the left parts of the nose and mouth are pulled down, the right are drawn upward. The mask symbolizes social relationships and their ceremonial interpretation. At the same time, it betrays how the Eskimo deal with irony and mockery and indicates their profound sense of humor. How does the person writing this know that? I mean, So here, it's a very authoritative voice, the expert's outside perspective, the broad cultural generalization. And then we have Selena's new object here, which I relabeled The Dark. And my commentary about this object, which says, a subterranean island used to be here, but its buildings were closed and pulled down by the king. Living beings consequently became mythical creatures, half real, open to interpretation. This solemn black contour, drawn and slanted through time, is a conspicuously popular piece. So using this method of bricolage to establish alternative aesthetic taxonomies, I argue, opens up new possibilities for interpreting material culture based on sensory, emotional, or even fanciful elements, or what Levi-Strauss calls the science of the concrete, which has at its starting point, and I quote, the speculative organization and exploitation of the sensible world in sensible terms. And he says there are two different routes towards what he calls scientific knowledge. One is close to, and the other is further away from sensible intuition. So he says the bricoleur takes the first path, working by means of signs, and then he says the engineer takes the second path, working by means of concepts. And then he claims that what he calls mythical and scientific thinking are not actually different stages in the evolution of knowledge. He says both are equally valid. He says, since scientific explanation is always the discovery of an arrangement, any attempt to systematize and catalog observed relations and connections, even one inspired by non-scientific principles, can hit on true arrangements. That's a quote from Levi-Strauss. So the idea is, in this project that we're planning, is that once we have a collection of these new objects and new texts, the next step would be to display them alongside the original artifacts and original descriptions at the Museum of World Culture. This is sort of the first phase of the project. So we hope that this would somehow challenge the nature of people's interactions with these archived objects, turn them into more of an embodied encounter, but also to destabilize the object's given functions, so things that have been taken for granted, how they were, framed and described by the people who collected them, or the initial curators or museum interpreters. And then use them to provoke a kind of sense of confusion, disorder, causing a crisis in the nature of experience, then gives these objects a certain power that they didn't have before. They could enter it allows them to enter the realm of the marvelous, to provoke dreamlike physical and emotional states, which, going then back to the surrealists, this is what they felt was the kind of key to providing a new awareness, a new social order. So when things are taken apart and put back together in this different order, there's an irreconcilable collision that produces a tension that then gives rise to new associations and meanings. So, and the interesting thing is, while anthropologists typically try to make sense of these kinds of discontinuities, this is what people in my field would be doing, trying to read into them, then the surrealists wanted to shatter any sense of reason. So I'm interested in looking at what can happen when we juggle both of these impulses at the same time and let them influence each other and coexist, which is something that, we can talk about that later. So as one surrealist artist wrote back in 1935, it is necessary to discover, handle, tame, fabricate irrational objects oneself in order to appreciate the particular or general value of those we have under our eyes. So by turning a series of existing photographs of artifacts and their scientific narratives into a new series of fictional images and commentaries, we want to create an alternative archival inventory that suggests subjective, imaginative, and provocative stories. So our new objects and texts, again, are only one of many, many possibilities of how a museum's collection might be reconfigured and reinterpreted. But we want to highlight the instability of these readings and then the multiplicity of stories that can be found within such a space. And then the sort of idea of the second phase of our project. So once we have this collection of texts and collaged objects, we actually want to somehow provoke the rematerialization of these images back into objects. So the idea is that we'll try to find people from the source communities where the original objects came from. So we'll retrace the objects back to the places where they came from and find people who were somehow associated with the original objects in the museum's collection that we chose to work with. Show the people from the source communities our collaged images and texts, emerge in a dialogue about these larger processes of making and also processes of memory will factor in, and then ask somebody in this community, and I don't know how realistic this is, but to manufacture a new three-dimensional object in response to our image, so in response to our creations. So it could be, they might want to recreate an object out of things like plastic bags or a 3D printer, or maybe they'll want to use more traditional methods and materials. We want to find out, would people even be interested in recreating these objects at all? What are their actual memories and of the roles and functions of these objects from their past? How will they respond to our sort of alterations of the museum's official ethnographic interpretation? So we're curious about where this will lead in terms of the status of the museum's existing collections, but also their processes of then incorporating new ones. So if we kind of, in a way, we would kind of try and commission the manufacturing of a new object, which then could add to this growing collection of sort of original objects and artifacts, bricolaged images, and then these kind of new three-dimensional objects made by the people who are connected to the original objects. So to kind of step back a little bit, in the field of anthropology, it is gradually becoming a little bit more common for anthropologists to operate through artistic practice, both in using the image to explore what's invisible or unsaid, but also in using objects themselves to investigate the relationship between the material world and acts of knowledge creation. And Tim Ingold, who's an anthropologist who's been here to speak several times, I guess, he calls it the anthropological art of inquiry, which he says stems not from a theorist's detached mental projections, but from a practitioner's approach to understanding, which involves forming ideas through the material engagements with the things around us. So for me, framing anthropological practice in this way reveals its experiential dimensions, which I think is similar to the idea of knowing through artistic practice, and maybe that's something we can discuss later. And maybe also these dynamics might be taken for granted in the art world, but I think their impact within academia shouldn't be underestimated, because it's this very tension, especially in my field, between adhering to anthropological conventions, but then also pushing the limits of those conventions. That's where it can lead to really exciting and new forms of academic knowledge. So as Levi-Strauss writes, the artist is both a scientist and a bricoleur, someone who constructs a material object that is also an object of knowledge. So throughout the course of this work, Selina and I were trying to embrace this kind of double identity as scientists and bricoleurs, as we raise questions about what it means to interpret an archival artifact through the strategy of the cut-up, and then further interrogate this oddly cut-up thing by physically recreating it once again. So by drawing upon, but also transgressing established traditions of anthropological classification and display, we're trying to provoke different kinds of intellectual, but also emotional and evocative encounters with the ethnographic archive as a whole, as an institution. So we hope to generate disruptions and different kinds of narratives, and new conversations between collections of artifacts, but also between ourselves as experimental sort of interpreters, and then extending back to the communities where these objects originally came from. So that's it for now.
Thank you for an incredibly complex sort of introductory paper, Alyssa. Because of its complexity, I'm wondering whether we can actually take some questions for you straight away, as opposed to waiting to Joe's presentation. So maybe there's some strong immediate things that we could take. Frederick.
Yeah, thanks a lot for a super interesting presentation and an important project, I think. I'm curious about the question of end result, or when this project, how you imagine the report, so to speak, or the book, or as a research project, or in other words, like the knowledge question here in anthropology. I mean, for me, when you bring up the surrealist the way you do, I mean, the problem there, is if you make it into scientific knowledge, or if you make, you have to close. Somehow you have to close the desire to go elsewhere. So there is no end in the way that they criticize positivistic notions of knowledge. And when you create this kind of project where you just want to where you trying to challenge the gaze of how we understand the collections and how they can rethought through introducing something that negates a specific notion of anthropological knowledge and bring that into a kind of parallel track. When you, in the end, if there is an end to this project, will try to reflect or categorize or reflect on what you have done, if there is this moment, I wonder if, like, how will you solve the question of closure there? Like, and I'm bringing up this question because I'm interested in people like Adi Warburg and André Malraux, who was also very much into anthropological questions, but when they, in the end, tried to finalize different kinds of works, they ended up with a very anti-dialectical position. So they ended up with, this is my contribution to...
A very what position?
A very anti-dialectical position. If the surrealists are super dialectical, like, I mean, surrealism is dialect. So I'm curious about how you, and you said that you were interested in the kind of assemblage way of looking at things.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how you think about that in relationship to the political impulse in surrealism. Like, that's too...
Sorry to interrupt, how many questions have you got, Fred?
No, but I'm just interested in how you think about the end result. Like, is there, you said that, okay, you want to do these kind of things, super interesting, but in, like, will it be an end to this, and how will you close it? Will you come up with a new concept of how, like...
Well, I think part of that has to be found out through the work itself. But one of the ideas we have for a kind of output, if you're asking about that, is to actually produce a catalog, an ethnographic catalog, but to actually really play with this idea of what a catalog is in terms of, you know, first of all, what its function is, but second of all, you know, this idea of kind of fact and fiction. So we have this series of objects, but the catalog will have a series of objects that actually don't exist, right? And then maybe we can play with what the texts do as well, and maybe have it be, the catalog itself be a kind of assemblage of different things, different types of writing, different types of images that come together in a certain way that will somehow encapsulate the spirit of what this project is. I mean, that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is, I mean, I don't know where it will end in terms of, first of all, we need to get funding to do this thing. So we need to start it. But I mean, after, like, then it's a question of, you know, having an exhibition, inviting other people then to produce objects and join the exhibition, and then what do you do with all this stuff? I mean, I think it has to come out of the activity in the project itself. But I don't know if that answers your question.
So in a way, it's a proposition, isn't it, the project?
At this stage it is,
You know, it's kind of, let's see what happens when we do this, can we actually critically engage with anthropology and ethnography through very specific kinds of artistic practices.
Right.
Because I think there's something really interesting about methodologies that would be kind of, you know, bringing up Warburg again, but to look at the methods of the anthropologist or the ethnographer and the methods of certain kinds of artistic practices that use those methods. I mean, is there going to be something produced around methodology from this project? I think there really might be.
That tends to be my work in anthropology. Also goes along those lines.
You know, can anthropology learn from artistic practice? Because if they're still shying away from the Clifford, for instance, then, you know, it could really kind of interrogate the discipline in interesting ways.
Yeah, so that's definitely part of the idea.
Ron?
Yeah. I was just wondering, because you talked about assemblage and recollage. So how far, I mean, I'm just curious, does it go in, you know, in a very, to achieve perhaps decolonized, you know, approach in interventions in museum? Because I got really curious when you said that for you it was important that you rewrote the text, but the words basically come from the original description. So in a way, you are setting some parameters for yourself and not really, you know, like going all out So it's basically, it's coming from there. And then also you're inviting, I mean, you hopefully, if you get the chance, to respond to the images that you have sort of, like these altered images that you have created. So I see that a lot of parameters have been set. So, and I understand that, I mean, assemblage and recollage is a way, perhaps, also to decolonize. But I'm just like a little curious, how far does it go in terms of, decolonization of these museums, especially ethnographic museums?
Yeah, no, I know, and that's a good question that I'm asking myself too. But I think inviting people in from the outside, from the communities where these objects came, that's the realm where this could potentially really have a big impact. I think, working within the existing structures of the museum, again, this is probably a theme that we're going to talk about all day, is how far can that go in and of itself. But I think, it's something that, it's a step that needs to happen anyway, to raise the, to kind of put it on the table, and then what you do with that can depend on what people decide,
Yeah.
But I agree with you.
Can I just respond?
Is it urgent?
It's urgent.
It is urgent, so
Yeah.
Lord. It
It's
is.
very short. Because there are some cultures where, especially in erstwhile colonial countries, that where a lot of cultures have their way of very surrealist way of coming up with counter narratives, and there is like the whole tradition existing there. And I'm just wondering if a project like this can benefit from those traditions, because there are many such traditions, at least the place where I come from, where they have like all kinds of oral narratives, and they look completely surrealist.
So, no, I think that's definitely a lot of potential there, and I think engaging with people is really going to be a huge part of this. I mean, it's the other stuff is like a setup to that, or a build up to that, but then it's like, okay, what really happens when we then go back and encounter these things that we don't know where that's going to lead. So definitely.
Thank you, Alyssa. We will have the chance to return to some questions from both sort of speakers, but I just want to check in if there was anything super urgent before Alyssa. But thank you for the meantime.